Hello, map makers. Thank you for joining me again. Today, I want to do something a little different from the last couple videos I made. And that is, rather than draw a map, I want to show you a couple maps that I've made already. The idea occurred to me because it became quite apparent quite quickly that if I were to make 10 map making fantasy ASMR videos, as I've been doing, they would all kind of look the same. I will continue with drawing maps for relaxation, but every once in a while I think I'm going to split it up by doing something just a little different. Same idea, same theme, map making ASMR, but we're going to dive into my little box of goodies here. Now, my first thought was maybe I'll start at the very first map I made, and we will go forward in time to show you how much better I got. But I decided instead that I want to do the exact opposite. I want to recognize that I am an amateur artist by all rights and means, and I want to recognize that I have a long ways to go. So I thought rather than do something to show how good I am, I decided instead to have a little laugh, and hopefully we'll have a good time seeing some of the older maps I've made. This might be a bit of a shorter video since it's just going through a couple pieces of paper. Well, maybe not a couple, you'll see. But how about we jump into it and see what we have. I go back every once in a while and see my past works, and it can be a lot of fun. But some of them I do forget about, and so some of these reactions to maps will, well, you'll be right there with me. Some of them I'll have fond memories of, some I won't even remember making. This one, for example. I experimented a bit with making lines along parallels, which, as well as natural borders, but you can see some of these dotted lines along here. It's along a parallel broken by this river, and I want to explain real quick what I mean by parallel is the latitude level of Earth. And you have these horizontal lines that go across every world, I suppose, any sphere, and it's very common for these straight lines to be used to make natural borders. Now, you'll see these more in more modern countries where they can easily calculate and map latitude lines for the purposes of borders. Sorry, something on my glasses. And something I also did here, which we'll see in some other maps, is country names. For a little while now, well, the other two videos I've done so far, you'll see quite a bit of not really these large names. I'm still not sure how I feel about it. That particular usage, especially since I do fantasy maps, and those tend to be more, magic-themed medieval times, essentially, and so you end up with a lot of kingdoms with just one big capital city. But anyway, this is the satrap Kingdom of Lemuria. And then just to practice my cursive, I'll write in a whole little explanation of what it is. It's usually nonsense. Alright, let's take a look at the next one. Oh, wait a second. There's one on the back. I was about to go right ahead and didn't even realize there's one in the back as well. So this appears to be the Pale. Now, I only called it this because I wasn't quite sure what else to call it, quite frankly. I've heard it used a couple times in cartography. I refer to two things, actually. There's a region of Skyrim in the Elder Scrolls series called the Pale, as well as I want to say, please correct me if I'm wrong, but around the 16th century, the English kingdom had lost most of its holdings in the island of Ireland, except for a little tiny spot on the east coast. It was called the Pale, and so I said, oh, well, maybe I'll call one of my maps that. Turns out the reason it was called that is because it comes from a Latin term which means stakes, and that the Pale was to describe an area of land that was fenced off. So, by calling this island, small continent, whatever, the Pale kind of implies that all of it, or at least part of it, would have to be literally fenced in. So if I had to rename it, I would, but, you know, I already wrote it down. Alright. Now, next up, we have Feila. I'm actually rather like this one. Although I did just notice the very strange drawings I put in the wastes of Gaul here. They're a little creepy almost. And if anything, maybe even take away a bit from the actual map art, if you will. Now, of course, with fantasy maps, I actually love extra artwork in there, but a lot of this was just experimentation. I've mentioned before that map making is one of the few visual arts I enjoy or are very good at. Nothing on the back of this one. So a lot of the things that are supposed to look like anything besides, well, a map is a bit difficult for me, so I consider those some experiments. Alright, next up here, we have at the time of recording, this is the latest draft of the continent that a novel that I wanted to write takes place on. We're going to see a lot of these. Fair warning, we're going to see a lot of this map. It's going to look a little different every time, obviously, but this is my latest, so I was pretty happy with it. I wouldn't do everything the same, obviously, or else it would have been the final draft. But this is a map in which there are multiple large cities, multiple large states within more than one kingdom. This is an empire, so it kind of makes sense there that there might be multiple kingdoms within an empire. Although, of course, in real life you have places like the Holy Roman Empire that weren't any of those things. You know the whole joke. It wasn't holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But you see up in the northeast here, we have a kingdom with two different cities. So I said, well, I already made the map. How do I justify it in the lore? Well, one county is owned by the king. It is a fief he granted upon himself, and then down here on the other side of these hills is another county, led by a vassal who is ruled by the king. Right? Let's see if there's a back. There's not. Alright. So this is a neat one because this is one of the few places that I drew that are a real place. Now, let me expand on that. You might have found it a bit obvious that at this point I rather enjoy making maps up. I oftentimes go into making a map without having much of a plan. Some may call that cheating. It is cheating. It's way easier than making an actual map. Different skill set, sure, but in my humble opinion and experience, I'd say drawing something that's already written and just copying something is actually a lot harder. I'd say it's easier to paint a woman than perfectly recreate the Mona Lisa. Fair? Fair. So, I wanted to do a real place, but naturally I wanted it in my own style. And so I came up with the question, what would it be like if we drew a map of Pennsylvania in the style of a fantasy map? And besides the map being a bit, well, Pennsylvania should be about this big. It turned out this big. So, my first time drawing Pennsylvania, I ended up with a bit of a skinny guy. But I kind of liked the style. I added a few little embellishments that I would keep, much like that other map you saw of Surrey for the novel. I said, well, maybe it'll be fun to write a little story about this too. So one thing led to another, and now I have an outline of a story about, well, the United States if it were to be feudal United States. It's a very unrealistic thought, and so there's a lot of, I guess, justification you would have to write into the story in order to get anything that makes sense. In any case, it was fun to make, and turned out okay. Alright. Now this one, the Duchy of Regalorum, this was when I was trying out faded country names. So, in this map, it's kind of hard to see. You know what? You can tell from my little writing here that this was a map I referenced in my last video. So you can see well, I guess you can't see. It's a bit hard to read, unfortunately. But this was my first practice map for a video. I never intend to release that video. It is neither relaxing nor quality content. And is very, quite frankly, not worth the time to edit. But this one's a little neat because I tried fading the country names. You'd see me eventually write them in full opacity in order to make it readable, but I would just not draw over existing things. Alright. And what do you know? It's another map of Surrey. So, this was a map I drew right after I drew a map of Middle Earth. That was for a Christmas present, actually, for my fiance. And I tried some of the art styles that I kind of learned from making that map, and not only making the map, but also emulating Tolkien's art style of map making. And you can see that in, I'd say, the forests. In this light and camera, it's hard to make out exactly what those blobs are. And I think it gets blurry the closer you get, unfortunately. One day I'll have a camera meant for this sort of thing. But those are all individual little circles over here and individual little triangles over here that I just sat and drew over and over and over again. It looks neat. I don't dislike it, but I also kind of like what I've been doing. I like the where they're separated a bit, so that when you look at it from this angle, you don't have to say, what are those blobs? Oh, and also it looks like I drew this in Comic Sans font. So, hence my desire to draw the one you saw earlier. Right. This next one is actually the only color map I've done. It's in colored pencil, which, first of all, I would not recommend. You really are supposed to use watercolor. Is at least the next thing I want to try. There were a couple mistakes I made in this map. One of them was that I meant to put a kingdom all the way over here, but I colored the borders and scribbled in the wrong place, so I said, you know what? This spot here, I'm going to give it a different border color, and now they're in a rebellion. Not even the first time I've done that, and it will not be the last, because mistakes happen. And so sometimes you just gotta roll with it. Right? There is another one on the back of this piece of paper. This is an interesting one here, isn't it? You can kind of see all the little corner embellishments I made. I tried to be creative. I just wrote random Latin-sounding words in a circle there. It looks kind of neat. I wrote a little, I drew a coat of arms. And this is another one where I used both faded out country names as well as the very small, tiny little circles to all next to each other to represent trees. I even drew some little sea monsters and ships there. And even though, as I go on, I hope to get better and improve my skills. But it's very obvious that you can have your own personalized art style and it can still look pretty good. When you watch instructional videos, don't be afraid to say, I'll try it. I might not like it or keep it, but I will try it. Always try instructions you get. Now, if you were looking at this map upside down, you might have recognized it. And if not, you might now have. This is supposed to be a map of Tamriel. For my map-making friends familiar with the Elder Scrolls series, you will recognize this. So, I've always liked the map of Tamriel, but this is far from one of my better maps. And here's why. The mountains are just regular peaks. They're not jagged at all, and it almost just makes them look like hills. And even worse, the hills are very boring. I like to make them at least a little jagged. It just gives it a bit more character. Other thing you'll notice, besides Cyrodiil not being in the middle of Cyrodiil, it should have been like here and not here. But it feels empty. I mean, look at Skyrim. I drew, you can actually count them pretty easily. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11 trees in Skyrim. Now, granted, there are grasslands over here, and swamps over here, and tundras, and more swamps. But even here in, there's supposed to be a forest around this area. There's not a lot of trees there. If I had no idea what Tamriel was supposed to look like, I would have seen this map and said, wow, there are not a lot of trees on this continent. Where are all the forests? Even if you look in Valenwood, yes, there are representations of clumped trees. So, it's not the worst representation. I think at that time I was on to something. But I was still figuring it out. The final thought is this was the first time I tried doing a double coastline. That's just to put emphasis on the coastline to make it more defined. But until this point, and even after this point, because I didn't like how it looked, I was just doing the waves, the little wavy lines that go on the left and right side of all the coastlines. What I've learned, and also I didn't shade in these hills at all, so they just kind of look like random bumps. Whereas the mountains are shaded, so they just look out of place. It turns out you should do the double coastline border as well as the waves. Whatever you do, however that works for you, do it. But I recommend trying everything, like I said. And even more than once. Because I tried this, and I said, I don't like how it looks, and I never did again. Well, then I tried doing both, and I fell in love with it. Because I posted a map on a map-making subreddit, and that was the feedback I got. Or actually, no, excuse me, it was a Facebook fantasy map-making group. Pretty much any resource you have can be useful. But I actually a lot of time on that group, they'll just say, looks good. And that can be nice to hear. but I actually had to say, give me advice. I want to reach the next level. And that's what they told me. They said, I like your borders, but they don't look defined enough. It just kind of looks messy. Kind of, oh, I don't know. This map, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. And it's actually for a lot of the same reasons as the last map. There are things I like about it more and things I like about it less. The thing I like about it is if I had to do one or the other of that whole coastline definition, I prefer the waves over just doing the double coastline border. Now, if I could redo this map, I'd do both. That is one of the things I'd redo. The other thing is, look at that compass rose. That is not a good compass rose. And I'm not even talking about because it's very unpleasant to look at. It's also because I didn't even use a ruler. Now, this wasn't entirely my fault. I just took way too long to get a ruler. So that part is my fault, not getting a ruler. But I did the best with what I had at the time, which was way too long. But just like the map of Tamriel, it's rather sparse. I mean, there's a tree here and a tree here, but there's just not a lot to it. It's not pleasing to look at. It doesn't tell us a whole lot. This was before I took the leap into drawing in names of things myself. I was using a computer because I did not I didn't trust my own handwriting. Alright, next up here. Alright, this next map might look a little strange at first, but turn it around. And look at that. It's Europe. So, I actually kind of like this one. I gave this one as a Christmas present to someone else because I did not get them a gift in time. Or what was it? Oh, I forgot to... I couldn't think of a gift. There it was. So, about 4 hours before our friend's Christmas, Friendsmas. So I made this as a present for Friendsmas because I couldn't think of what to get someone. So I spent 4 hours, I spent a whole afternoon just making this map of Europe. So this is another example of an actual map that I made. Well, only thing I particularly dislike is at a certain angle, a right angle, you can kind of see Italy's a bit thick. Otherwise, I was pretty happy with this one. And it's rather difficult to see, but I did draw in little light dotted lines, the country borders. And all in all, it came out pretty good. Better than some of the other maps of real places I've made, but I do think that's what I'll do for my next video. I'll make a map of a real place. That is another attempted draft at the map for the book, the novel I wanted to write. Right, this one. This is another just kind of nothing special map. I think we're gonna, until I get to the nostalgic ones, I guess you could say, I'm just gonna feel a little less and less special about some of these, but hey, this was my idea. However, now this map, this is a good map right here. Let me tell you why. This is another Surrey, another one for the book. And I wasn't confident enough to write the names. And so there's no writing here, not even the title. However, I think this was a big step in the right direction for me. This was when I tried to attempt to make individual trees for forests. However, I came up with a name for this specific draft, and I call it Big Tree Surrey. You can guess pretty easily why I call it this. And that's because the trees are bigger than the cities. Otherwise, I liked a lot of the stylistic decisions I made. I like the shading of a lot of the things. I was really playing around with, the coastlines. This was, for a while, one of my better drafts. Moving on. We have... Ooh. Well. If it isn't my map of Middle-earth. Now, I do have a more, I guess you could say, complete version that I gave as a gift to my fiance. But you get the basic idea of how I made where I kind of drew inspiration from my other maps. But at this time, I was still using a computer to draw in names and titles of places. But I do like a lot of the shading, the coastlines. I think in this particular example, I like the style I used for forests, especially in this big old one right here, where the elves live. Alright. Well, if it isn't another draft of Surrey. I like the coastlines in this one, but just the same kind of thing. It's very sparse. There's the representation of trees, but not the representation of forests. And that's, even if you do draw individual trees, like you've seen me do in my other videos, those are pictures of trees that represent forests. Here, they're just pictures of trees that look like, well, trees. Here was another attempt that I just wasn't fond of and I gave up on. That's something you need to be willing to do. Sometimes, I'll be honest, quitting isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes you need to start over and get a fresh start. It's a lot better than finishing something that you hated to begin with. Another Surrey. Same things. Sparse trees. But going back, I do like that I was trying to group them together to make them more like forests. In this example, you can see maybe even more trees, but they're all singular and still very spread out. Alright, let's get a look here. Oh, this isn't actually a map. I did this because I was having a problem with the Surrey maps at this point, going backwards in my map making. And I had a problem with the story matching up with what I actually drew in the map. So rather than change what I wrote, I said, well, what if I'm making more drafts anyway, what if I just adjusted the drafts to make it work? So I added a city here, and I made it taller, and I moved this city over there. So this was specifically for planning. Not much else to say about that. Now, at this point, you might say, well, Ryan, these are a lot of maps of the same place. Well, You might also say that while I was very passionate about map making for the longest time, I also really enjoyed the writing aspect of it, making a story out of these places that I drew. And so, since I ended up writing it's a draft, granted, but a whole book really. I wanted this map to be perfect. So, I think there are two comments I have on this. The first is that I drew dots for cities instead of little iconic depictions, which is fine, but when you have a fantasy map, there's something really cool about the little cities, and that's why I think I like drawing trees where there might obviously be a forest, but it looks cool. In fantasy maps, especially when it's not of a real place, or, well, obviously if it's fantasy, it's not a real place, but something that doesn't exist yet. So take my Middle-earth example, as opposed to a map like this. You might say, well, I know there are trees there, but I want to see them. So I tried drawing trees. I tried a different strategy. I drew blobs, if you will, and then made small details within the blobs to make them look like forests. This is a very legitimate strategy for making forests. In fact, for a first couple attempts, I mean, this might actually be my only attempt at doing it that way, I don't hate it. If I continued with that strategy, it may have looked really good, but I kind of picked an art style that I've been running with, and this just happens to not be it. But I do like where I was going with it, though. You'll also notice I tried these little crisscross boxes. Those were supposed to be farms. Didn't work the way I wanted it to, and so ditched that idea, because there are better ways to depict farms than just crisscross line. And then what I really disliked, though, was the mountains. I mean, these are... It's kind of hard to define, but you see how it's drawn in a line to the left, and then to the right it's just kind of shaded and just looks blurry. Well, it was supposed to be the shadow, but it didn't quite work out. But the important thing was, I tried a different art style. I heard someone say that they liked drawing maps this way, and I gave it a shot, and I said I didn't like it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So long as you tried it, then you're allowed to say that I don't like it. Another map of Surrey. Like I said, we're going to see a lot of these, but we do see... Oh, I can hardly tell which way's up and down. This is kind of a funny looking one. This is another example of individualization of depictions, I guess you could say. So, rather than draw dots for cities, I actually drew little castles. They don't look very good, but I gave it a shot. And I think when you're doing it more for artwork rather than actually trying to tell someone where to go on a map, I do like using the liberty of space on a sheet of paper to, well, make artwork. So we have little castles, and I like that I shaded in these mountains. As we go further back, and we got a little ways to go, you'll see that I didn't realize how valuable shading was. shadows are so important to adding depth and character to any aspect of a map, any artwork, really. And I also tried dotting the border. I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure what I was going for, per se. It's almost a combination of that double outlined coastline and the waves. I did a lot of experimental things here. And so it made for a decent enough coastline, quite honestly. But I think once I found my rhythm with double outlining as well as the waves, I decided that's the way to go. So this depiction of Surrey actually was drawn after Big Tree Surrey. I just put it further back in the lineup because I didn't like it as much. So apologies that this isn't exactly in chronological order, but I think you get the idea. With this one, I took up too much space and yet not enough space with the trees. And I'll explain. You can see here that this is a very forested area, which would be accurate to a Dark Age level technology based fantasy world. There's gonna be a lot of woods. So, but it just kind of looks like there's nothing but woods. And sure, we have plains over here, and then more forests. And I kind of like that. I think if I had to choose which one of these little areas, one of these regions I like the best, I'd say this. You would have remembered this was the Empire that I drew. The reason I like that is because it's not one-dimensional. And I mean that from a personality standpoint. If this map had a character, it has more than one trait to it. I mean, it's got hills, and it's got a couple of different rivers and lakes and trees and islands breaking off of it. And that's a good amount of things. I was still practicing with the artwork, but I think I did pretty good with that. But then you move along to this place, and it's just a lot of what I continue to do that we saw. The kind of lots of trees, but they're so spaced out that it looks like random trees all over the country without any forests. It's a difficult balance to try and achieve, and it takes practice. But at a certain point, you kind of get a rhythm and you figure out the best way to be able to draw things that are both pleasing to look at as well as accurately depicting what is supposed to exist in your fantasy world. Alright, now we're getting to the real good stuff. We're gonna see here this sort of very irregularly defined coastlines. Barely any trees at all. I mean, I could probably count them on two hands. I like that I went for the icon depiction of cities rather than just circles and squares. And even though I was still trying to figure it all out, but I do like how many rivers I have. That's another hard thing to try and figure out a balance for, is just how many rivers to have. Because as you zoom in on a map, you're going to see more rivers. As you zoom out, you're going to see, well, maybe the same amount of of rivers because the more space you have, the more water you're going to have. But they're, when you zoom out, they're going to be more major rivers. So this is another Surrey. I was still going. So I guess at this point I was still going along with the detailed blob, we'll call it, style of forests. So I gave that a shot. I tried drawing some palm trees here, some tropical looking trees, and they look like triangles on sticks. So I think if I want to draw some more tropical locations, which is probably a good idea so I can improve my skills, I'll go ahead and maybe I'll do some research into how to draw some better palm trees for the purposes of a map. Alright, now this one does have a story behind it. While I was writing my novel that featured all of the maps you were seeing, I kind of decided, well, if I'm gonna try being an author, even for, just amateur writing, I still want to get better at it. So halfway through my book, I put the thing down, figuratively, and I took a little class for creative writing, and I wrote a short story about an elf mage. And I said, you know what this needs? What the story needs? It needs a map. So I drew a map. Now, we can see that not only was it early in my writing career, it was also early in my map making career. Relatively, anyway. You can... Oh, that's a cat. Come here, Bones. Bones. Okay. We'll see if I cut that part out. Anyway, this was the map I drew. And on the other side, a more vertical oriented one. This one's kind of interesting. We have a desert right in the middle. So I'm guessing that this continent is very tall for it to span two solid bits of two hemispheres. And I also tried representing different biomes by drawing little circular trees here and pine trees over here. I actually rather like this one. I was still trying to figure out coastlines, of course, but I was kind of, at this point, realizing that I liked it when I exaggerated even more these little dots that I put down to the side of each coastline, because otherwise it doesn't pop out as much. But I like this part especially. So let's take a look. You can see that they are individual trees, and they're not even a bad size. It's just that for this map I made the castles so small that they pale in size in comparison to the size of the trees. So I wouldn't actually change the trees at all. I would just make the settlements bigger. But taking a look right here, I did a couple things right, actually. I made shadows for each one. It's kind of... Shadows are a tricky thing, but always include shadows. That can be my rule, as if you figure an art style that you like, but can't really get to the next step, try drawing shadows on more things. You'd be surprised. So I like the density of the trees. You can see it's dense in here, kind of less dense over here, and that makes for a feeling of individual trees that you can see in the artwork, but it also looks like a forest rather than just down here where you have tree here, tree here, tree here. it just works. If there was one thing I could change, I would make these mountains more jagged. I think I did even a good job with that as well. But once you start having single peaks that don't really do anything else, they start to look too much like hills, and you want to make that differentiation, especially since I drew hills here. However, I did not shade them, and so they just look like lumps. So there's that. Another Surrey. Another map there. This was, I guess this would have been another attempt at doing the drawn out coastlines. Now, I'm not sure exactly what dissuaded me from keeping up with it, or from doing both double outlined coasts as well as waves, but I also have mixed feelings about the forests. I think it looks okay for this little pine forest we have here, but that's the only one. As well as the rest of them just don't do it for me. I think the blobs are too big. I think I would have gained substantially from very literally just cutting some of these in half, just so it's not like giant forest. And then I made a neat little chain of barrier islands there. I don't think that's realistic at all, but maybe if I wrote a story, I'd say something magical about it. A wizard made it that way. Ooh. Now this might look somewhat familiar. I guess this is technically the first color map I attempted, so I was wrong about that earlier, but this was actually another Surrey. But it's starting to become very evident how far I came since I first started, even doing this one. The mountains are just half triangles. The forests I can only recognize as forests because they're green. It's a good start. I'm glad I figured out different creative little things. I mean, if you look closely, I put a little river delta right there. That's kind of neat. A river that splits off, and so I think I was starting to get the grasp of basic geography and how to depict that in a fantasy map style. But you can imagine how seriously I was taking this map. Not much more to say about that one. And then this one is, I like that I made these mountains jagged. These ones are a little too tall and not wide enough, though. And these are, I kind of like how I made dunes look. It's a little difficult to see. It's not very well, it's not very dark penciling in. But I also gave a good go at two things I do really like. Is that I made the cities unique. I mean, very unique. As well as I was still giving a good effort to draw in by hand the names. Kind of took a break from that because I just kind of felt like doing it on the computer was better. But that is cheating. And then, but you know what I really like about this map is this little skeleton of a sea monster here in a desert. I think that's neat. Alright, ooh, what do we have here? Alright. I'm not actually entirely sure which way is up. I believe it's this way, though. It is a top-down view, so quite frankly, I think the more I look at it, the harder it's going to be to tell which way is supposed to be north. But this is my, I've made city maps a couple times before, but I think this was my first real attempt at making one that wasn't meant to be so cartoonish, I guess you could say. I'm going to hold it up a little closer because you can see right through it because I used thinner paper. Maybe it'll be something I return to. I think that would be a good other project. So I'm glad I made this little exploration because I think that would make for a good video. A map of a city. That will be a bit of practice, though, for me. I'm definitely not at the same level with drawing cities as I am with continents or entire countries. Not much to say on this one. I titled it I Don't Like It. Like I said, if you get off to a bad start, don't force yourself to draw the rest of the thing, unless you know it's for practice. Which, you know, obviously many of these are, but if you really want to get a map that you can say, yeah, this is the one. I'm drawing a thing. I practiced a couple times this very map. As you can see, I did 100 times over. Sometimes you gotta say, you know what? This just isn't gonna pass for my final version, and I'm ready for a final version. You can scrap it. It's okay to scrap ideas. So, I lied once again. This is another color map. Once again with colored pencil. Would not recommend. I would like to start on a watercolor, though. I was a little afraid to interfere with some of the other things I drew already, so I did not draw the names in right next to the cities. As you can see, I kind of did a almost scientific diagram. Not sure what else to call it. But I think for one of my earlier attempts, since we don't have much further to go, not bad. The other side, that is a handful of islands. I guess you could say an archipelago. I'm not really sure what the scale exactly is supposed to be, but there's a legend you can see here. This was when I was still trying to learn things on my own before I really looked up instruction. If you ever want to get good at something, don't do that. look up instruction, learn from the greats. Another Surrey. I guess I did a lot more with color than I recognized. I definitely stepped away from it though when I realized that colored pencil is not a good way to color a map. It has its uses, not for map making. This is a close-up of the kingdom in which a good amount of the early draft of my novel took place. And then here was the larger map that I based that last map off of. That last one was this spot over here. So as you go on through all this, you can see a lot of simplicity. All of these, the coastlines are very round. I think what I did do right though was in the few spots where there was maybe let's take a close look here. Even though it's very round, I found this little spot where it goes in. And I connected a river to it. So in my other videos, we talk about how, whereas in the real world, cities are built on rivers, you need to plan when drawing a map because you kind of need to you need to draw your rivers around the cities, just for art, stylistic purposes. But I like that I drew the rivers into the mouths of the ocean. You're never going to have a river that's just running along and then boop, ocean. It's gonna curve into a bay. And I drew a little note on the back that was my first draft of Surrey. Looks like I had more paper than maps. But, so this is my last one. I'll give you a story. I was actually in the hospital. And I was awfully bored, so I asked for a piece of paper, and I knew very little about drawing maps at the time. But I wanted to draw a map based off of this map. This map. Because I had only drawn it once, I did not have a picture-perfect memory of what it looked like. And so I just kind of said, well, what's it matter? I'm only doing it because I'm bored. Not only did I give a go at it, I also got a little creative and said, well, if I'm drawing a different map of the same place, it might look different. What if I made a simpler looking version of it? Not even to share, even though I am sharing it with you now. Well, let's use it for inspiration for a story. I had a dream once about these vampire women, and it was a whole thing. I wrote a story about it, and so I made that the setting. I came up with different lore, different country boundaries, and I had a good time with it. So let's put these guys back where they came, back in the vault. For another day, I feel like opening up my little treasure chest. And those are my old maps. I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you relaxed. I hope you learned something. Or, if anything, were just entertained by my early attempts at map making. Whatever you got out of this video, thank you for watching anyway, and have a good night.